She faced losing her child at the cattle market until a silent rancher defied despair. The autumn sun hung low over the town of Dustridge, casting a hard light across the cattle market. The air smelled of sweat and dust, of manure and iron, of men shouting as wagons rolled over the rutted earth. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer clanged from beyond the pens, and cattle bawled as traders raised their voices to argue over prices. Dust drifted through the air like smoke, settling on hats, boots, and weary faces. It was a day for money and trade, for business and cattle. But at the center of the square, a woman knelt in the dirt, her hands bound with rough rope, her face streaked with tears. Clara's bonnet had slipped back, and her hair, the color of wheat left too long in the field, clung to her damp cheeks. Her wrists were rubbed raw where she had struggled against the ropes, but she no longer had the strength to fight. Her eyes were fixed on the small child being pulled from her arm. Emily's faded calico dress was worn thin from long walks, her little boots scuffed and dirty, but she was all Clara had left. The girl's cries cut through the noise of the market, and Clara's own voice cracked as she called for her, begging for mercy. "Please, do not take my child," she cried, her voice shrill and raw. "She is only a little girl." Bart Crowley stood nearby, a man dressed in a black coat that shone in the sunlight, his gloved hand resting on the silver head of his cane, his lips curved in a smile that was cold and cruel. He had once been a trader, but years of scheming and buying debts had made him rich. Clara's husband had died that past winter in a mine collapse, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and sorrow. The bank had taken the land, and Bart had taken the notes. Now he stood ready to take more. "No property, no coin, no collateral," Bart called out for all to hear. "The girl comes with me until the debt is paid." The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one moved. A salesman muttered, "It ain't right," but his eyes dropped to the ground. Clara lunged, catching her daughter's boot as the hired man dragged Emily toward the wagon. The man shoved her back, and Clara fell hard, her shoulder striking the dirt. Emily's cries grew fainter as she was pulled away, her small hands clawing at the air. Clara clawed at the earth, her voice breaking into a scream that silenced even the cattle. For a moment, the world stilled. Dust swirled across the square, and men looked away rather than watch a child taken from her mother. Then boots crunched against the hardpan. A figure stepped away from the hitching posts, a bay horse waiting behind him, reins trailing in the dirt. His wide-brim hat shadowed his face, and the crowd shifted again as if pushed by an unseen wind. Clara lifted her head through the blur of her tears. She saw him then, tall and steady, his coat tugged by the breeze. He said nothing. He only moved forward, slow and certain, until every eye in the market was fixed on him. The silent rancher had stepped into the dust, and nothing would be the same again. Bart Crowley's laughter drifted through the market like smoke, thin and bitter as Clara's pleas fell to the dust. Emily twisted in the arms of the man who held her, small fists beating uselessly against his chest, her cries tearing through the still air. Clara tried to rise, but her knees buckled beneath her, her body weak from hunger and despair. The crowd looked on in silence, their faces carved from stone, unwilling to risk the wrath of a man as powerful as Bart. It seemed the day would end with a mother torn from her child, and no soul willing to stand in the way. Then came the sound of boots, steady and unhurried. Jack Rohr moved forward, the brim of his hat hiding most of his face, yet his presence alone stilled the whispers. The bay horse trailed behind him, reins dragging, as though it too followed without command. He stopped in front of Clara, then turned his gaze toward Bart Crowley. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence carried weight enough to hush the market. Bart's sneer faltered, but only for a moment. He straightened, tapping the silver head of his cane against his palm. "What is this, then?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You come to buy cattle, rancher? Or are you just here to watch a widow lose what she cannot keep?" Jack's hand reached into the folds of his worn coat, slow and steady. The crowd leaned forward, half expecting steel. Instead, he drew out a leather pouch, its sides sagging heavy. With one measured step, he let it fall to the ground between himself and Bart. The sound it made was a dull, heavy thud, But in that silence it echoed like thunder. Bart blinked, his lips curling with disbelief. He crouched, tugged the cord loose, and peered inside. Gold spilled against the light, coins glimmering bright as fire in the sunday. A gasp rippled through the crowd, men shifting to catch a glimpse. Even the sheriff, who had stood lingering at the edge of the square pretending not to notice, took a step closer now. "That covers the lien," Bart muttered, his voice uncertain. "All of it." He looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing at Jack. "Well, well, the silent rancher speaks with gold. What now? You buying the woman too? Or maybe the girl comes with the livestock?" A nervous laugh fluttered through the market, but it died quickly under the weight of Jack's stare. His eyes locked on Bart, steady as stone, not pleading, not angry, only final. The man holding Emily shifted uneasily, his grip loosening. Jack stepped closer, slow and deliberate, placing himself between the child and the traitor who claimed her. Still he said nothing. Emily's tears streaked through the dirt on her cheeks. She reached out, trembling, and Jack's shadow fell over her as he extended a hand. The hired man released her at last, unwilling to defy the silence that pressed upon him. Emily stumbled forward, clinging to Jack's leg. Clara, still bound on her knees, stared in disbelief as Jack bent and untied the rope from her wrists with rough hands. She whispered one word, her voice breaking. "Why?" But Jack gave no answer. He only lifted her gently to her feet, his silence speaking louder than any promise. The wagon wheels creaked as they left the noise of Dustridge behind, rolling over the hard ground that stretched into miles of empty land. The market faded into silence, though Clara still felt the eyes of the crowd on her back, still heard Bart's laughter buried in the dust. Emily sat close beside her, clutching the edge of her mother's skirt, her small body trembling each time the wind shifted. Jack rode ahead on his bay horse, his back straight, his shoulders broad beneath his worn coat. He had not spoken a word since he placed the pouch of gold at Bart's feet. He had not explained, not asked, not promised, and still Clara followed, though her heart beat with unease. The trail wound through dry plains where only scrub and scattered cottonwoods broke the horizon. The air was sharp with the smell of sage, and each gust lifted grit that clung to Clara's skin. Emily leaned against her, eyes heavy with exhaustion, her small hand tangled with Clara's fingers. Clara watched Jack's figure, steady in the saddle, his every movement calm, as though silence itself obeyed him. She could not understand why a man would give away such wealth for strangers. She wanted to believe it was kindness, yet her years of hardship whispered that nothing came without a cost. When the sun dipped low, the outline of a ranch rose ahead. It was no grand place, only a house weathered gray, its paint long gone, a roof patched with tin, and a barn that leaned as though the wind had bent it. Fences ran along the pastures, their posts rough and crooked. Yet there was order in the lines, a sense of care in the way each rail was mended. Jack slowed his horse, opened the gate without a word, and led the wagon toward the barn. He moved with the same calm strength he had shown in the square, steady and deliberate, as though this land answered only to him. Clara climbed down with Jack's help, her feet unsteady on solid ground. She expected him to ask for thanks, for some vow in return, but he only nodded once and turned toward the barn. She stood in the yard, Emily pressed against her side, staring at the house that was now before them. Its shutters hung loose, its steps sagged, and yet, to Clara, it looked like a place untouched by Bart Crowley's reach. For the first time in months, she felt the faintest flicker of safety. Inside, the air smelled of dust and pine smoke. Jack led them down a narrow hall and opened a small room at the end. A simple bed stood against the wall, a wooden table with a basin beside it, and shelves stacked with folded blankets. He pointed once, then stepped back. Clara touched the blankets with trembling fingers, unsure what to say. He turned without speaking, his boots echoing on the worn boards as he left them alone. That night, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, unable to sleep. Emily curled against her, breathing soft, her small hand resting in her mother's palm. From the next room came the sound of Jack's footsteps, slow and steady, the movements of a man long accustomed to silence. Clara listened, her heart caught between fear and gratitude, wondering what kind of man would risk gold and reputation for a woman he had never met. She had walked into the unknown, and yet somehow, for the first time in a long while, she did not feel lost. The morning sun crept over the ridge, spilling pale light across the yard of Jack Rohr's ranch. The air was cool, sharp with the smell of dew on dry grass, and the faint sound of roosters carried from the barn. Clara rose early, her body still aching from the long journey, and stepped quietly into the kitchen to boil water. She moved as though each creak of the floor might disturb the silence that clung to the house. Emily followed soon after, her little feet pattering against the boards, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes still heavy. She climbed onto a stool, watching her mother stir the pot, but her gaze wandered to the window where Jack walked across the yard toward the barn. Emily pressed her nose against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Jack moved with unhurried steps, shoulders set and calm, his figure solid against the brightening sky. Emily whispered to her mother, asking why he never spoke. Clara had no answer. She only told her to sit and finish her bread. But Emily was not content. When the meal was done, she slipped outside, her small boots crunching on the gravel, and ran after the silent man. Clara called after her, but the child did not stop. Jack was carrying a bucket when Emily caught up. She tugged at his coat, her face tipped up toward him. In her hand, she held a yellow dandelion, plucked from the edge of the yard. She lifted it high, her voice clear and bright, saying it was for his horse. Jack paused, his shadow falling over her. He looked down, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. For a long moment he did not move, and Clara, standing in the doorway, felt her heart twist with fear that he would turn her daughter away. Instead, Jack bent on one knee, took the flower with a rough hand, and tucked it behind the bay's ear. Emily clapped her hands, laughing with delight. The horse flicked its ear, and Jack gave the smallest nod, a gesture that seemed to settle the air around them. From that morning on, Emily followed him everywhere. At first, she trailed behind, quiet and cautious, watching as he mended fences or spread hay in the stalls. She asked questions that he did not answer, but he never told her to leave. She named him Mr. Quiet, then Uncle Jack, the words tumbling from her lips as though they had always belonged to him. Clara watched from the porch, her hands busy with chores, yet her eyes drawn again and again to the sight of her daughter at his side. One evening, as the sun sank low, Emily carried a small crown of flowers she had woven clumsily together. She placed it on Jack's hat, while he knelt to mend a saddle strap. For a moment, Clara thought he might remove it, but he only let it rest there, his hands steady on the leather. Emily laughed and hugged him around the neck, and though his face did not change, something in the stillness softened. Clara stood with her hand on the rail, her breath caught in her throat. The silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a space where something new was beginning to grow. The days began to settle into a pattern, slow and steady like the turning of the seasons. Clara rose before the sun, her body moving with the rhythm of habit, sweeping the kitchen floor, boiling water, and setting bread to rise. The little house creaked with every step, but she grew used to the sound, just as she grew used to the silence that seemed to linger in every corner. Jack left at dawn, his boots striking against the yard as he saddled his bay horse. He never spoke more than a few words, yet each movement carried a quiet certainty that steadied the air. Clara watched him from the window, while Emily rubbed sleep from her eyes and whispered that Uncle Jack was going to the fields again. Clara found herself learning the small ways of his life. She noticed where he kept the flour in a barrel beside the stove, how the knives were hung sharp above the table, how much coffee he measured into the tin pot each morning. When she folded his shirts, she placed them on the edge of the table just as he seemed to expect, and he always gave a small nod when he found them there. She began to cook simple meals, beans, bread, and sometimes rabbit if she could trade with a neighbor. At supper, Jack tipped his hat in quiet thanks before taking his place at the far end of the table, and though little was said, the room felt less empty than it had before. Emily filled the silence with her laughter. She followed Jack into the yard, clambering up fences to watch him mend rails, trailing after him with endless questions about horses, ropes, and the land. At first he answered with a gesture or a grunt, pointing where she should stand or how she should hold her hand flat to stroke a horse's neck. Over time, Clara noticed the small shifts. He lifted Emily onto the corral fence when she was too short to see. He left a piece of biscuit at the corner of her plate each morning. He paused long enough for her to catch up when her little legs could not keep his pace. Clara kept her distance, unsure where she fit in this quiet rhythm. She swept the porch, scrubbed the pots, and carried water from the pump. At night, when Emily had fallen asleep with dirt on her cheeks and flowers still tangled in her hair, Clara sat on the steps, watching the light fade from the hills. She saw Jack returning from the fields, his shirt dark with sweat, his hands stained from labor, and though he only gave her a nod, something in that look held weight. It was not pity. It was not demand. It was a steadiness she had not felt since before the mine had taken her husband. The days stretched on, each one simple, each one hard, but within that hardship was a strange comfort. The silence no longer pressed heavy on her chest. It moved around her like a rhythm she could almost understand, like water smoothing stone. And in that rhythm, Clara felt the first stirrings of belonging, as if the land itself was beginning to make a place for her and her child once more. The night was still when Clara woke to the sharp scent of smoke. At first she thought it was a dream, the kind that came from too many nights of worry. But then Emily coughed softly beside her, and the smell thickened. Clara rushed to the window, her heart hammering, and when she flung the shutters open, her breath caught in her throat. The barn was burning. Flames licked high into the sky, orange against the darkness, sparks flying across the dry grass like fireflies turned to ash. The roar of the blaze filled the night, drowning out even the wind. Clara snatched Emily into her arms, stumbling down the hallway and out into the yard. The air was heavy with smoke, choking and hot, and the livestock cried in terror from within the barn. Horses kicked against their stalls, cattle bellowed, and the dry boards groaned as the fire ate through the roof. Jack was already there, his figure moving like a shadow through the flames, hauling buckets from the pump. His shirt clung to his body, sweat and soot mixing with the smoke, but he did not hesitate. He plunged into the barn, disappearing into the blaze without a glance back. Clara screamed his name, but the fire swallowed her voice. She set Emily down on the grass and ran to the pump, yanking the handle with all her strength. The bucket filled slow, too slow, her arms aching as she dragged it toward the fire. Jack burst from the barn, with a calf thrown over his shoulder, the animal kicking weakly as he set it down on the grass. His face was blackened, his hands raw, but before Clara could reach him, he vanished again into the smoke. Emily cried behind her, her small body shaking, but Clara could not stop. She filled bucket after bucket, throwing water on the edge of the fire, though it seemed to do little more than steam. The barn's roof shuddered and groaned, a beam collapsing with a crack that split the night. Clara dropped to her knees, fear twisting her stomach. Then Jack stumbled out again, dragging a limping cow by its halter, coughing so hard she thought he would fall. He shoved the animal into the yard and turned back once more. At the edge of the property, 3 riders sat on horseback, their figures black against the fire's glow. Clara knew the man in the dark coat, even from a distance. Bart Crowley sat tall in the saddle, leaning on his cane as though even fire could not touch him. His men did not move to help. They only watched, their faces lit by the blaze, and Clara's blood turned cold. This was no accident. This was revenge. Jack emerged again, this time with 2 horses, shoving them into the yard before the barn gave another shudder. Flames swallowed the doorway behind him, and the night filled with the crash of timbers falling. He staggered into the dirt, his body bent, his hands burned, and he collapsed to his knees. Clara rushed forward, dropping beside him, her tears streaking her soot-covered face. Emily flung her arms around Jack's neck, sobbing into his chest. Clara pressed her forehead to his shoulder, whispering through her tears that if it were not for him, they would have nothing left, nothing at all. From the hill, Bart Crowley and his men turned their horses, their shapes fading into the night as the barn sank into flames. The fire roared, but Clara held Jack and Emily close, her body trembling with the knowledge that the blaze had not been meant to destroy the animals alone. It had been meant to destroy the man who stood between Bart and his greed. Yet Jack had faced it as he faced everything, silent and unyielding, and though the barn was lost, the family he had saved clung to him with a love that the fire could not burn away. The days after the fire moved slow, each hour marked by the smell of smoke that lingered over the ranch. The barn lay in ruins, its blackened timbers jutting from the ground like broken teeth, and yet the animals that survived grazed in the pasture, alive because Jack had gone into the flames again and again. Clara cleaned his wounds with trembling hands, wrapping strips of cloth around the raw burns on his palms, dabbing water across his blistered skin. He never flinched, never complained, only sat silent while she worked, his eyes fixed on some far horizon she could not see. Emily hovered near, carrying buckets of water, whispering soft encouragements and placing wildflowers at Jack's side, as though they might heal what her mother's hands could not. Clara moved through the days with quiet determination, but inside, her heart ached with questions she dared not voice. Why had he risked his life for her and Emily? Why had he given away years of savings to buy them back from Bart? Why did he stay silent when every action of his spoke louder than any word? At night, she lay awake, Emily curled warm against her, listening to Jack's footsteps in the next room, steady and slow. The house that had once felt foreign now felt like a place where her heart was no longer hunted, yet fear and hope tangled together so tightly she could hardly breathe. It was Emily who broke the silence. One evening, as the sun bled soft gold across the hills, Clara sat on the porch brushing her daughter's hair. The little girl wriggled free, running barefoot through the yard, until she came back with a flower crown woven from daisies. She placed it on her mother's head and laughed, then turned her eyes to where Jack leaned against the fence, his arms folded, his figure dark against the fading sky. Emily tilted her head and asked, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, "Ma, do people choose their fathers?" Clara froze, the comb caught in her hand, her breath caught in her throat. She forced a small smile, asking what her daughter meant. Emily's voice was clear, innocent, yet steady, as she pointed toward Jack. "Because I think I want Uncle Jack to be mine." The words hung in the air like a bell rung too loud, the kind that could not be silenced once struck. Jack turned his head slightly, just enough to show he had heard. For the first time, Clara saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not coldness, not even sorrow, but fear. Not fear of danger, not of Bart, but of what Emily's innocent truth had exposed. He took one slow step forward, then stopped, his hand resting on the fence rail as though he needed its strength. Clara's heart pounded, torn between wonder and dread. She wanted to hush Emily, to protect Jack from the weight of words he had never asked for, yet she could not. Her daughter's honesty had stripped the silence bare. Emily stood, small and certain, her face glowing in the dusk. "He fixes my saddle," she said softly. "He makes sure we have warm food. When I get scared, he always comes. That is what a father does, isn't it?" Clara reached for her child, pulling her close, but her eyes never left Jack. The sky deepened to violet, and the first stars began to shine. Jack's gaze met Clara's, steady yet trembling at the edges, as though he had been struck by something he could not fight with gold or steel. In that look she saw not just strength but longing, not just silence but a love that had waited too long unnamed. The question had been asked, and though no answer came, the air between them carried it like a vow unspoken, one that would change everything. The wind carried a sharp edge that night, restless and dry, whispering across the plains as though it knew what was coming. Jack sat on the porch, sharpening a blade beneath the pale light of the moon. His movements were calm, steady, but his eyes shifted often toward the horizon. Clara stood in the doorway, Emily clutched tight in her arms, her own breath caught by a weight she could not name. Then the sound reached them, faint at first, Then louder, a rumble of hooves rolling like thunder across the hardpan. Jack rose slowly, slipping the knife back into its sheath. From the distance came torches, their flames bending in the wind. Riders appeared one by one, a dozen or more, their silhouettes sharp against the night. They spread across the outer fence, circling the ranch like wolves around prey. At their front rode Bart Crowley, his dark coat glimmering with firelight, his cane resting across his saddle, as though even here he needed to remind the world of his power. His voice rang out across the yard, carrying over the thud of hooves. "Jack Roar," he called. "You took what was mine, and I've come to reclaim it." Clara's grip tightened around Emily, her body trembling as the child buried her face in her dress. Jack stepped down from the porch, his boots striking the dirt with slow certainty. He moved until he stood in the center of the yard, the glow of torchlight catching his weathered face. The rifle that leaned by the wall was now in his hand, not raised, not pointed, but carried with a steadiness that made the riders shift uneasily in their saddles. Bart's smile curled, smug and sharp. "You think you can keep them, rancher? That woman and her brat are mine by debt and by law. No amount of gold changes that." For the first time in all the weeks Clara had known him, Jack's voice rose, deep and unshaking. "They're not yours." The words cracked through the air like a shot. The riders murmured, startled, to hear the silent rancher speak. Jack took another step forward, his eyes locked on Bart. "They're not something to own, not something to steal. They're mine because I chose them, because I protect what is mine." Clara gasped softly, her knees weakening. For in those words she heard not a claim of possession but a vow. Bart's sneer faltered, then hardened. He lifted his hand high, and the riders stirred, their torches flaring as rifles gleamed. The air was thick with the taste of smoke and iron. Jack raised his rifle at last, his stance firm, his voice steady one final time. "You will not take them." For a long heartbeat the yard held its breath. Then the crack of gunfire shattered the night. Horses reared, men shouted, bullets tore through the fences, and the quiet ranch turned to a battlefield. Clara dragged Emily behind the wagon, her heart pounding with terror. Dust rose in a storm, and through it all Jack stood at the front, his rifle flashing in the firelight. His voice silent now, but his vow ringing louder than the chaos that raged around them. Gunfire ripped through the night, sharp and deafening, sparks flying where bullets struck wood and stone. Horses screamed as men pulled at their reins, the yard filling with smoke and dust. Jack moved with steady precision. His rifle braced against the trough as he fired into the torchlight, each shot deliberate, each movement calm, though chaos tore around him. Clara crouched behind the wagon with Emily pressed against her chest, her heart racing so hard she thought it might burst. The child sobbed softly into her dress, and Clara whispered promises she was not sure she could keep. Bart's men spread wide, their rifles cracking as bullets shattered fence rails and kicked up dirt at Jack's feet. He shifted from cover to cover, his figure clear against the firelight, his coat flaring as he reloaded with practiced hands. He dropped 2 riders in the first volley, but there were too many. Clara saw him stagger once, his hand flying to his side as blood bloomed dark against his shirt. He gritted his teeth, pushed himself upright, and kept firing, though his steps faltered. Clara could not stay hidden. She shoved Emily behind a stack of crates and ran into the open, her skirts catching on the dirt, her voice tearing from her throat. She reached Jack's side just as another shot grazed his shoulder, spinning him back. He fell hard, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Clara dropped beside him, her body shielding his, her hands pressing desperately against the wound at his side. His face was pale in the firelight, his eyes burning with pain. Yet still he tried to rise. "You don't do this alone," Clara whispered fiercely, her tears streaking down her cheeks. "Not anymore." Bart rode closer, his figure looming tall in the glow of the flames, his pistol raised, his voice dripping with triumph. "Move, woman. You are protecting a dead man." Jack's breath came ragged, blood at his lips, but his voice rose clear and strong, stronger than the pain that threatened to steal it. "You don't touch them." His words cut through the noise, ringing sharp and final. "They're my family. The gunfire stilled for a heartbeat, the weight of his vow sinking into the men around him. Horses shifted nervously. Riders glanced at one another, some lowering their rifles. Bart's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing with doubt. Then from beyond the trees came the sound of more hooves, not Bart's men, but others, neighbors and ranch hands drawn by the fire and the noise. They rode in with rifles raised, shouting Jack's name, not for pay and not for fear, but because when the silent rancher spoke at last, his words carried like a command. Bart's men wavered, one turning his horse, another pulling back into the shadows. Bart cursed, fury twisting his face, but he saw what had shifted. His power had broken. With a snarl, he yanked his horse's reins and fled into the night, his torch held high like a bitter flame retreating into darkness. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the restless stamp of hooves. Clara pressed harder against Jack's side, her hands shaking, her tears falling onto his chest. He winced, but a faint smile curved his lips. She leaned close, her voice trembling. "You said it," she whispered. "You said it out loud." Jack reached up with a blood-stained hand, his touch gentle against her cheek. "Because it's true," he murmured, and his eyes, though heavy with pain, held a vow stronger than steel. The firelight flickered across his face, and in that glow Clara saw not just the man who had saved them, but the man who had chosen them, claiming them not with gold or silence, but with the words that turned strangers into a family. The night after the raid hung heavy with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. The yard was littered with broken boards, spent cartridges, and dark patches where blood had soaked into the dust. The neighbors who had come to Jack's side worked quickly to gather the wounded and drive off the remaining horses, but when the last of them left, the ranch fell into a deep stillness. Clara sat by Jack's side in the small bedroom, her hands trembling as she pressed cloths against his wound. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and each time his eyes closed, she feared they would not open again. Emily hovered close, whispering soft words to him, as though her little voice alone could keep him tied to the world. She laid flowers across his chest, calling herself Doctor Emily, promising that he would get better. Jack did not speak, but sometimes his lips curved faintly, as if her small courage reached him even in fever. Clara bathed his brow with water, changed his bandages with care, and prayed silently with every heartbeat that he would endure. The hours blurred together, long nights where the wind rattled the shutters and the lantern burned low, and still she kept her vigil, never leaving his side. On the second night, she sat with her head bowed, her hand holding his, when his fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open, hazy at first, then clearer, fixed on her face. She leaned close, tears spilling freely, but when he tried to speak, she shook her head. "You have already said everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When you stood between us and death, that was enough." His eyes closed again, but his hand tightened weakly around hers, and for the first time since the fighting she allowed herself to believe he might survive. The days that followed were slow, each step of his healing measured like the ticking of a clock. Emily brought him water and wildflowers, tucking them into the folds of his blanket, declaring each morning that he was stronger than before. Clara watched color return to his cheeks, listened to his breath grow steadier, and each time she replaced a bandage, she traced her fingers over his rough skin with care, as if her touch alone could mend him. Jack spoke little, only short words when needed, but the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like survival, like something they both clung to. When at last he was able to sit upright, Clara helped him to the porch where the air smelled of rain and ash. The barn lay in ruins still, but neighbors had promised to return and raise a new one. Emily sat at his feet, braiding blades of grass into crooked circles, her laughter chasing away the echoes of gunfire. Clara stood behind him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She felt the strength beneath her palm, fragile yet enduring, and she whispered softly that he did not have to be alone anymore. Jack did not answer, but he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers with a weight that made her breath falter. In that quiet, she understood that love was not in the words he did not speak, but in the life he was willing to fight for. The sun dipped low over the plains, painting the sky with streaks of rose and gold, and the ranch lay quiet after weeks of turmoil. The fences had been mended, the fields were calm, and though the barn was gone, the neighbors had promised to help raise another. Clara stood on the porch, her hands resting on the rail, watching Emily chase the dogs barefoot through the grass. The child's laughter drifted on the wind, bright and healing, and Clara felt something stir in her chest that she had not known in a long time. Hope, fragile and full, had begun to return. Inside the house, Jack moved carefully, his body still stiff from the wounds he carried. He was stronger each day, the fever gone, though the scars remained red and raw against his skin. He had spoken little since the night Bart and his men had come, but Clara no longer feared his silence. She had come to know it, to understand it, to hear in it what words could not hold. When she set food before him, he gave a small nod. When she folded his shirt on the table, his eyes lingered long enough to thank her without sound. She no longer searched for sentences, for she had learned his language in the quiet. That evening, Jack stepped onto the porch, his boots scuffing against the worn boards. In his hand he carried something folded, a scrap of cloth, faded and frayed. He stopped in front of Clara, his face unreadable in the glow of the setting Sunday. Slowly, he opened the cloth, revealing the little ribbon Emily had worn the day he first saw her in the market, tangled and torn, but still whole. He held it out, his rough hand steady, his voice low, but clear. "I kept it." Clara's breath caught, her eyes filling as she touched the ribbon with trembling fingers. It was only 3 words, yet they carried all the weight of the gold he had given, of the fire he had fought, of the blood he had shed. She looked up into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw not silence but love shining steady and sure. He did not move closer, but when her hand brushed his, she felt the truth of it, a vow stronger than any spoken before an altar. Emily came bounding up the steps, dirt on her cheeks, her smile wide as she clutched a crooked daisy chain. She placed it on Jack's arm and declared with the certainty of a child, "Now you belong to us forever." Jack gave the faintest smile, small and rare, but enough to light the moment. Clara laughed softly, pulling Emily close, and for the first time in years, the porch rang not with sorrow, but with joy. That night, as the house glowed with firelight and the scent of stew filled the kitchen, Jack leaned down and kissed Clara for the first time. It was not hurried, not fierce, but steady, born of every quiet promise he had already kept. She leaned into him, her heart full, and knew she had found not just shelter, but a home, not just a protector, but a man who loved her without needing to say it. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Western Love Legends, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every tale reminds us that, even in the silence of the frontier, love can speak louder than words. And who knows, maybe even Jack himself might tip his hat if you do.